My name is Maeve Griffin and I am an employment solicitor with Fieldfisher Ireland. I'm joined by my colleague Ranjit Dhindsa, who is the Head of Employment, Pensions, Immigration and Compliance at Fieldfisher UK. Today we're going to talk about the Gender Pay Gap Information Act 2021. The Act has been described as an important step on the road to equality by increasing transparency of gender pay gap within certain organisations operating in Ireland. We are still waiting on more detailed regulations clarifying the specific reporting obligations for Irish employers, and you can find more information on this from previous blogs on our website www.fieldfisher.ie. However, we expect the mandatory reporting process to begin from 2022 onwards. Similar reporting obligations were introduced in the UK back in 2017, and I'm delighted to be joined by Ranjit, who will provide an insight on what this might entail for Irish employers and how best to prepare for the first reporting deadline. Ranjit, from your experience of working with clients in the UK, what were the biggest challenges in preparing for the first reporting deadline?
Gender pay reporting was introduced in England and Wales for both the private and voluntary sector in 2017. However, the legislation applied to large employers only, those with 250 or more employees. This meant that many small employers were exempt from the legislation, although they could of course have reported voluntarily if they wanted to. The English model was seen as being prescriptive and simple in terms of the information that needed to be reported. Despite this, there were challenges for employers in complying with the new law. We received a number of different queries. They related to who should collect the data, how should the data be presented, should a narrative be attached to the data, what should the narrative say, would the calculations be audited. There was frequently a huge underestimation about the time and resources needed to gather the data and analyse it. Different people in the organisation had to be involved in the project. For example, the finance team often needed to collect payroll data. The data then had to be analysed and interpreted, often by HR teams. And then the PR and communications teams would be involved in helping communicate the reports. In England and Wales, the gender pay gap data difference had to be reported on the government portal and on an employer's website. This might be different in Ireland. For large employers, international employers, there were additional challenges. Not only did they have to comply with the law in England, but many decided that they wanted to analyse the gender pay gap throughout their organisation in all the countries that they operated. This meant that they went a lot further than simply complying with the law in our country.
That is really interesting, and I suspect that Irish employers will have similar queries. It seems that employers should give themselves enough time to understand their legal obligations, gather their correct information, and to really engage with it to understand what it really means. I do think that putting in that effort now will bear fruit when it comes to the communications piece, and it'll be really important to be able to explain the data to employees, stakeholders and the public audience.
Maeve, that's absolutely right. Employers need time to comply. In our experience, employers have fallen into two groups in the UK. The first group are those that have complied with the data as a minimum. They've collected it, they've reported, they've done nothing else. Then there's a second group. This second group have really analysed gender pay gap data and considered it as part of their general inclusiveness and diversity strategy, or their ESG strategies. And they've invested a significant amount of time in trying to really deal with any disadvantage that they have found. In addition, while the law in England and Wales required reporting on the government portal and on an employer's website, the second group of employers went further. They decided to share the information they had gathered with employee representatives, unions or works councils. And where there were none, some went even further and decided to report directly to the employees. Often this was married in with their feedback on employee surveys.
And what about the aftermath? Were there any consequences for having a gender pay gap, and how did employers in the UK deal with this?
In England, there has been a high level of compliance, particularly in the first 2 years of the new law. All employers who were required to gather the information and report on it did so in the first and second year. There was also a lot of media attention, and many newspapers named and shamed employers who had huge data protection gaps. However, since then, the focus on gender pay has reduced, and there could be a number of reasons for that. Brexit, the pandemic, and perhaps the shift in focus to ethnicity and race as well as gender. This, together with a very weak enforcement regime in England and Wales, means that many employers have now perhaps not complied as much as they did in the first 2 years, and there really hasn't been that much of a change in the gender pay gap. For that reason, many campaigners are lobbying for greater enforcement in the UK. The UK government has also committed to reviewing the legislation in 2022. Enforcement in the UK is through our Equality and Human Rights Commission. In 2019, they wrote 46 companies who they felt didn't comply with the law. Since 2017, they've carried out 6 investigations. But as I've said, there's not really been any sanction as such because the enforcement under our regulations is quite weak. The last 2 years have created an extra challenge for gender pay reporting. In 2020, the need to report was suspended. In 2021, the time limit was extended from April to October 2021.
Yeah, the enforcement regime is actually very similar here in Ireland. However, the legislation has been criticised for not going far enough. This is mainly because there's no financial sanction or penalty for having a gap. It is also because the obligation is to simply identify any gap that might exist rather than to actually address it. Do you think that reporting has made a meaningful difference to tackling gender inequality in the UK?
Maybe it's too early to tell if there really has been any difference. Different commentators report different findings. For example, in October 2021, the Financial Times reported that the gender pay gap in the UK had widened despite the efforts by government and regulators. According to the article, the gender pay gap is getting worse in many sectors in the UK, such as retail, hospitality, construction, finance, insurance, energy, and education. One factor that could be contributing to this is not only less focus on gender pay, but the negative impact of the past 2 years on women in the workplace. Many have been furloughed, others have reduced their working hours, others still have left the workforce altogether to deal with their caring or other responsibilities. In the UK, those individuals are not captured by our gender pay gap reporting data. In another report, this time by the London School of Economics in March 2021, it was found that the gender pay gap had closed. However, the reason for this was that men's pay had not increased substantially over women's pay in the last 2 years. The report also criticised the way that data is collected in the UK. For example, it doesn't differentiate between occupation, part-time and full-time status, different job roles, different sectors. In other words, the UK data is very crude. An influential report carried out by the Fawcett Society and King's College London in October 2021, called Bridging the Gap, concluded that in 7 countries, Australia, South Africa, France, Sweden, the UK and Spain, the difference in gender pay gap had not really changed that much. And this is despite the fact that countries like Australia and Spain have reported on gender pay gap much longer than we have in England and Wales. The real issue is enforceability, and without greater enforceability and accountability, it's difficult to see how things will change.
Okay, so it seems like there has been mixed results. At the very least, it is starting a conversation and raising awareness of the issue. We have seen some organisations in Ireland voluntarily publishing their gender pay gap data. On Post, for example, which is the state postal system here in Ireland, they started reporting back in 2019 when their gender pay gap was just under 3%. They have recently announced that they have completely eliminated their gender pay gap in terms of average hourly pay. This is a great success story, and it just proves that change can be made. We just have to wait and see whether other organisations can make similar progress.
The point is, one size does not fit all. Every organisation is different, and the board and senior leadership team will need to be committed in order to make any change meaningful.
Thank you for sharing your experiences, Ranjit. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation and I found it really insightful. I've no doubt that Irish employers will benefit from all of the tips that you've shared with us today.